Welcome back to Know Your Bible, and I'm Reverend Birgit Gaudreau. Today we're going to study Genesis chapter 41, part 2, and I'm doing this chapter over again because of certain issues. So enjoy the study with me today. So Joseph was in prison another 2 years until the cupbearer mentioned Joseph. And he only mentioned Joseph because Pharaoh the king had 2 dreams. And then he remembered that Joseph can interpret dreams. In those 2 years that Joseph was waiting for the Lord to take him out of this prison and captivity, he was praying and worshiping the Lord daily. And he trusted and had faith that God would redeem him out of this terrible world of prison, where there's no windows, there is no good food, or there is no real friendship. There is just punishment day by day. So everything is God's timing, and God's timing is perfect. So God gave Pharaoh 2 dreams, and he was positioning now Joseph to come out of prison, and it was his plan that Joseph would come into a high position beside Pharaoh. Joseph was in prison for a good 12 years, and I can imagine that some days he thought, my life is not worth living with what he was going through in that prison and the situation he was in. But he never lost his faith.
Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine-looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly gowned, such ugliness as I've never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the gowned and the ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows. When they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as at the beginning. So I awoke. Also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, full and good. And behold, 7 heads withered, thin and blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them, and the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me."
So God gave Joseph the interpretation of the 2 dreams that Pharaoh had that bothered him so much that he called all the magicians and all the wizards and witches to tell him what the dream meant. Of course, none of them could interpret the dreams. So here is Joseph, the humble young man. And so he gave Pharaoh the interpretation of the dreams, and Pharaoh realized that this young man had wisdom above all the others. And so it was to be that there should be 7 prosperous years and 7 years of famine.
Verse 25 to 31. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which come up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty heads, blighted by the east wind, are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe."
Pharaoh, the great leader of Egypt and all the land, he realized that Joseph had the spirit of a great and mighty God. And so he positioned him as second in the land to lead the land and also to give everyone instruction to prepare for the 7 famine years.
Verse 33 to 36. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine.
The signet ring was very important. It was like a stamp or a signature that was used at the time. So when Joseph would give a command to have anything done or instruction and show the ring, it had to be done. Also, the gold chain around his neck was a sure sign from everyone of his authority when someone looked at him.
Verse 37 to 45. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regarding to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, Bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Sephaneth-Paneah, and he gave him a wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt.
To Pharaoh, Joseph was also a source of wisdom and counseling and intelligence to him. Pharaoh knew that Joseph needed a good wife, so he gave him the daughter of a high priest. And so she was a good companion and also support for Joseph.
Verse 46 to 49. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Now in the 7 plentiful years the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain, as the sand of the sea, until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable.
So just before the 7 plenty years, Joseph married and had 2 sons, and he was extremely happy in his life. He couldn't have it any better at this time.
Verse 50 to 52. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my afflictions.
The 7 years of plenty were over, and with Joseph's wisdom and instruction, all of Egypt stored plenty of grain and food for the famine years, and they were ready. They were ready now for those famine years.
Verse 53 to 57. Then the 7 years of plenty, which were in the land of Egypt, ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph had said, the famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do." The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all the lands.
Some scholars believe that Joseph, with this high intelligence and wisdom that he had from the Lord, that he even built some pyramids to store the grains. None of this is proven, but some scholars do believe that it is true. The 7 years of famine had started, and now all the lands around Egypt were feeling the famine. Even in Canaan, where Joseph's father and brothers were, they couldn't harvest anything because of the famine, and they were starting to starve and realized that they had to go to Egypt. And Joseph was the one that made all the decisions. Pharaoh said that all had to come in front of Joseph when they were inquiring for any grain or food. Here we can see in this chapter how God has the power and the authority to turn around your life or change everything, no matter how hard your life is and what you're going through. And here Joseph is a perfect example to keep faith, praise and worship, and God will redeem you at the perfect time. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoy this chapter as much as I enjoyed putting the lesson together. And I'll see you again next week when we study together Genesis chapter 42.